a lot of you wanted to talk about this issue of how we judge rational authority or how we can correctly determine whether somebody has rational authority or not, so that we can make sure their credibility in our mind, in our eyes, matches their rational authority. And the worry many of you had was that this sort of always leaves room, this idea of determining somebody's rational authority and then always leaves room for bias or prejudice, um, maybe coming both from us and from the sources we get our information from, so those around us, things in the media, government, internet, things like that. If there's always going to be room for this sort of gap between rational authority on one hand and credibility on the other hand, then we're going to have this sort of notion, this epistemic injustice is going to sort of keep popping up in these sorts of ways. At least this mismatch will keep popping up, whether it's from injustice or not. That's another question, I guess. But this mismatch between rational authority and credibility. Many of you are noting, we want credibility to match rational authority. We want them to be the same. But given the way the world is and given the way we are as thinkers, it seems like it's very hard to know how much rational authority something has, and therefore how much credibility we should lend it. I think, this was a persistent theme in many of these questions, and I think that's latching on to how difficult this really is of a question. And I think it's a very hard question theoretically. That is, like, in theory, what's a general procedure for telling what the rational authority of some person or group is, or source is. It's very hard to give a general procedure. Any sort of reason you might give for something having rational authority, you're going to have to, in some sense, be trusting some other source or trusting yourself, and you have to look at your bias. And so if we're skeptical enough, we might be led to a general skepticism about sort of whether we can tell whether something's trustworthy or not. And that's going to be a problem for both the way Fricker thinks of knowledge in terms of testimony and reliable informants, but just about the way we think of knowledge. Ordinarily get knowledge from other people, from news media, from the government, from the internet. How can we know who to trust? I think theoretically this is a really worrisome problem because we are biased, because the world does set out to deceive in many ways. But I think in practice, though theoretically it might be hard, in practice it might not be actually that difficult, or it might not be as difficult. Maybe it's getting harder all the time, but we can think about our source and we can look at their track record. If it's a person, have they gotten the stuff right in the past? Do we know, or have they tried to deceive us or others? We can look at whether the source is corroborated by multiple other sources. Do other people say this? Or if we're looking at, say, news media or internet, we want multiple sources for the information we're getting, especially when when it's a sensitive or important piece of information. We want to know whether to trust the source on it. Are they a rational authority on that source? Well, one way you might try to figure that out is saying, do other sources corroborate it? And sources, sort of different kinds of sources. It's probably not that helpful to say, well, Breitbart said this, and the Drudge Report also said this, so that's good reason. Those are both sort of right-wing internet newsy kind of organizations, or on the left you might say Jacobin and Democracy Now! If they both say the same thing, then it's maybe not as trustworthy as if you get Fox News and MSNBC both reporting, and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the National Review all reporting on a single event and saying the same thing about it. You might think, well, I can trust them. I can trust any one of them to have rational authority on this event now because it's sort of been corroborated in different ways. Finally, you want to pay attention to the credentials of the source. Is the person you're speaking with, is the person you're getting this information from, are they the sort of person who you would think has access to this information? So you might trust a climate scientist over some random person on the internet to know more about climate science. Similarly with, anybody chatting on Twitter might be less of a reliable source than New York Times or the Washington Post or or any kind of more well-known or well-established media like that. And so I'm not saying this is a general procedure. It's not. But in practice, I think there are good ways of thinking about the track record of sources, the credentials of sources, and whether the sources sort of corroborate each other across a wide range of what you might call ideological or political differences. And this applies both to things like news organizations, but also to people. What are their rational authorities? Depends on their credentials, their track record, and how they are corroborated by other sources.